Hello, welcome to the Frans van Kat interview. I'm Annette Young. As the world continues to navigate its way out of the global financial crisis, every aid dollar or euro spent becomes that much more precious. One of the biggest players on the aid scene is the US Agency for International Development, better known by its acronym USAID or USAID. It's working in some 100 countries. Some of the more notable locations include Mali, Afghanistan and Iraq. And here in the studio with me today is the agency's Deputy Administrator, Ambassador Donald Steinberg. Ambassador Steinberg, thank you so much for being with us.
Delighted to be here.
Let's begin with a country that's very much dominating the world headlines at the moment, and I'm talking about, of course, Mali, which is facing chaos thanks to the coup and also the Tuareg rebellion in the north. What sort of programs is your agency running in Mali at the moment?
Well, Mali has always been one of our shining stars. It has been a democracy, one that has very much cared about the economic and social empowerment of its own people. And we have very aggressive programs in food security, in global health, in climate change, in education, and humanitarian assistance throughout Mali. But those are now threatened.
Yeah, and that's what I want to talk about, the impact that these events are having on your operations.
Well, our humanitarian operation has been expanding. We have some 200,000 internally displaced people who we're trying to ensure are safe and secure in this environment. But we have regulations that require, when a non-democratic shift in government occurs, that we cut assistance that is not humanitarian. And so we are in the process of suspending our assistance to Mali and hoping, perhaps against hope, that the coup leaders see the error of their ways, transform their power structure back to the previously democratically elected government and allow us to continue to support the people.
This is very much the sort of situation that the US-led support have been trying to avert. I mean, this is a country which has had relatively a stable democracy for 20 years. Do you think Washington will rethink its aid presence in Mali as a result of all of this?
No, I don't believe that. We have seen a relatively small group of people exercise a non-democratic change, but the people of Mali have been very supportive of democracy, of respect for institutions. Indeed, as you suggest, they've had 20 years of democratic rule. And I don't believe that the actions of a small minority will affect in any very deep, fundamental way what we're doing there. Now, of course, if we look at the root causes of the coup, which relate to developments within the north with the Tuaregs, we are going to have to refocus our attention on addressing the social and economic factors that drove the process.
And how will you do that? Do you have any idea at this point?
I think we'll have to see, because frankly at this point we're still in the process of hoping that the regime leaders transfer power back to the government. But I do think we're going to focus more on the northern developments, on eliminating the basic problems that have caused some of the leadership in the north to even turn towards Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. So it is a wake-up call.
Now, heading to the Middle East, this is a region where your agency is being called on to play an important role in countries as they transition to democracy. For example, how difficult is it at the moment to operate in a place like Egypt, where there's been a crackdown on foreign aid organizations?
We have been working in Egypt for some 40 to 50 years, and our development programs have been very successful. We've helped transform the education system. We've improved sanitation and water conditions. Agriculture has turned around with these efforts. What we need to do, though, as we look to the transition at play here, is to encourage civil society and journalists and women and other people who have been disempowered over the course of the last 20 to 30 years and encourage their participation in the changes that are now taking place.
But it's a difficult situation, isn't it, when an aid organisation like yours is very much promoting democratic reform? You inevitably ruffle feathers along the way, don't you?
Well, it's a transition as well. And so our work at Play does ruffle feathers among the current leadership that wants to very much be in control of where the resources go. And it is a balancing act. We are largely based upon past experience, drawing on the advice and the wisdom of civil society, of youth groups, of women, to dictate where our programs go in the future. But there's not a democratically elected government in place. We are establishing new contact with the parliament. We're establishing new contact with state and local governments throughout Egypt. But we will be driven in large part by what the Egyptian population want.
But has it become that much harder to operate?
It has been harder in a transition period, but it is always harder in a transition period. Because in fact, what you are trying to do is both affect change in political and social areas at the same time that you're trying to address long-term economic security questions. And then if you throw in the question of trying to encourage equity, I mean, Egypt has had 6 and 8 and 10% per capita growth rates over the past decade. So it's not a question of just outright economic growth. It's a question of distribution of the benefits of growth. And it's a question of generating the jobs and generating the social developments that are important to the people.
Now, as a government agency, you're also operating in places such as Afghanistan and Iraq, and you're playing a very large role there, obviously, in their reconstruction programs. Now, these are places renowned for graft and corruption. How do you know where the money is going at the end of the day? How can you ensure a transparent transaction as such?
Well, much of the program that we do in those countries is through USAID itself or through contractors or non-governmental organizations who have very clear bookkeeping records, very clear transparency. With respect to work through the government or work through other institutions, we have a formal process we go through where we analyze the institution. And before we provide assistance, we want to know that they have the accountability mechanisms, that they have the transparency, that there isn't corruption at play. And so in the case of Afghanistan, for example, we went in and said, what are the government institutions, the state, the local institutions that we can work with? Regrettably, we only found 6 or 8 or 10 in that case. But it is always a question because in part, what we're trying to do is empower institutions that aren't quite there yet.
So how effective can these programs be?
They are extremely effective in terms of changing conditions at present. And in the case of Afghanistan, we've seen remarkable developments in terms of a reduction in mother-child mortality. We've seen tremendous increases in agricultural production. We've seen growth in education. We have 3 times the number of people back at school that were there 10 years ago, and we've basically moved from 0 girls in school to some 3 million at present. But what we need to do is encourage sustainable development so that when the aid dollars start to dry up and when the troops start to go home, that we're not going to be left with a situation where all of the progress we've achieved is for naught.
So, I mean, are you under enormous financial pressure given the current economic situation? Are you having to be that much more answerable to every dollar that's spent?
Yeah, we clearly in this tight economic environment, the American people and their elected representatives are saying what are you doing with every tax dollar that's been provided? But what's very important is that that has not translated into demands for substantial reductions in assistance. Our assistance this year is as high as it has ever been. Indeed, it's as high as any country has ever given globally in the history of the world. And the key here is that the American people seem to get it. They get that it's in our value structure to encourage peace and prosperity and respect for human rights. They get it that if the world is growing economically, it means more jobs for Americans and exports. And perhaps most importantly, they get that it's in our security interest, because states that are democratic and prosperous don't traffic in drugs and people and weapons. They don't transmit pandemic diseases. They don't harbor terrorists or pirates. They don't spew out large numbers of refugees across borders and oceans. And perhaps most importantly, they don't require American forces.
Ambassador Steinberg, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate the opportunity.
And that's it for this edition of the Frans van Kat interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly.